Of Myth and Mercy features adult topics and subject matter that some people may find disturbing. Listener discretion is advised. If you feel uncomfortable and need help, please contact your local crisis center. The North American Crisis Hotline numbers are listed in every episode description. The subject we're covering tonight deviates again from our plan, as we had stated in previous episodes and on our various social media platforms. See, the announcement I mentioned we were making is that my beloved co-host Cameron has become increasingly busy with some awesome and important personal projects. While she is still part of the Of Myth and Mercy team, she will only be in special future episodes. That being said, based on your responses to the Shinrikyo two-parter we released, you'll be happy to know that Alice will be joining me as a co-host on the regular going forward, including on this episode.
Hey everybody, it's Alice again. Yay! I am super excited to be joining Cass as a co-host, and I hope not to disappoint anybody too much. I will do my best.
We want to give a special shout out to the Now That I'm Older podcast, which can be found on Stitcher, iTunes, and Podbean. They're amazing. I'd also like to give a shout out to the Lady Pod Squad group. If you're a host of or a participant in a feminine-led or fronted podcast, I highly suggest looking up the hashtag Lady Pod Squad. It's great. I have been able to get a lot of feedback and information from them as far as technical stuff with podcasting, and you name it, they're just great. We also want to mention that we are super appreciative of the huge amount of love and feedback we've been receiving over the last few weeks. We can't overstate how amazing it is to know that we're providing knowledge and entertainment to so many of you. And we're taking all of your input, good and bad, to heart. And we hope it's recognized, of course, in the continuance of aspects you've told us that you love, as well as improvements that we've already applied and will be applying as we continue to record. If there's one thing that's known about India, it's that their labor market is cheap, which makes having a housekeeper fairly commonplace for families of even middle-class income brackets. Those with upper middle classes and higher incomes are often found employing numerous, if not dozens, of domestic helpers. In India's culture, it's not even considered demeaning work per se, nor is it considered to be an active indentured servitude if you are a housekeeper. It's not really seen as a slave-driven type of dehumanizing nature. However, there are a lot of kind of caveats to it, and it can have a darker nature, just like any kind of labor force. The income is reportedly better than waiting tables or working at a fast food restaurant, or at least it can be sometimes. These positions are described as being without any bondage, there's no contractual agreements or minimums to fulfill, which means that servants should be free to quit when they want to and if they need to. Having a job in domestic help, especially for young women who might be new to the workforce, can offer some place that's safe, is less physically strenuous than main alternatives, which include waiting tables or construction. And for a large population of those who pursue such positions, their job might come with an alluring perk, as many employers will sponsor the education of the domestic help's children. Now, all of these things seem positive, but again, there are risks in pursuing such a career.
The least of the concerns for this sort of job can include how rarely, if ever, benefits such as health insurance or retirement plans are actually included. Minimum wage laws don't cover domestic workers, which mean the average income is a meager $64 to $160 a month, forcing them to live paycheck to paycheck or even hand to mouth, and often in shanty towns, without electricity or running water. Cases of servants being mistreated and the indignities that many face daily are secrets often kept to the victims themselves. This means that there is no accurate record or statistic because of how slippery and unsupervised this sector of work can be. If you're able to land a legitimate position, you're lucky. However, most employment in this sector seems dangerous and results in treatment which some would call uncivilized. Worse yet, because it's kept such a secret, it isn't really traceable by authorities who collect taxes, let alone check for civil rights infringement. It isn't that labor laws to protect domestic workers aren't enforced, it's that there are no labor laws to enforce.
The Talwars are a happy small family who live in Jalvayu, Vihar, Noida in Uttar Pradesh. It's an area known as Sector 25, and it was known as a quiet, somewhat affluent location near Delhi, India. Nupar and Rajesh Talwar were practicing dentists with loyal patients and a loyal staff at their successful clinic, which they had run for years. They had a daughter who was approaching her 15th birthday named Arushi, and like most families in India, as we mentioned, they had domestic help. Hemraj Banjadi, a 45-year-old man from Nepal, was their current dutiful servant. And by all accounts, from everyone in the family and the neighborhood, he was great at his job.
On May 2008, on the night of the 15th, the lives of this small family changed dramatically with what any family would consider the worst of the worst in terms of tragedy. Their 14-year-old daughter, Arushi Talwar, was murdered. She was found the morning of the 16th. The teenage girl's parents, Nupur and Prajesh, found her body and immediately cast suspicion on their domestic servant, Himraj, who was noticeably absent from the home. To make things all the more unbelievably horrific, the next day, upon the terrace of the Talwar's home, the body of Himraj was found. His remains were badly decomposed, but he showed obvious injuries and wounds that would lead to his death. Himraj had been brutally murdered like Arushi, if not more viciously and violently than even she had been. Both murders were estimated to have occurred sometime around midnight, mere hours prior to the Talwars finding her body.
So initially the police thought the case was going to be open and shut. The evidence, of course, pointed to an insider job, which complicated things slightly. Both of the victims' throats had been sliced with a surgical precision that would have really only been seen from somebody in the medical industry, is at least what their initial thoughts were. Both had suffered bludgeoning to the head. Hemraj had been first, the pathologist had kind of theorized. His head wounds appeared to have been made by a hammer, followed by that throat slit, which had actually left his throat basically agape. Just the wound was pretty wide open and pretty gory. Arushi had been murdered in a similar way. A heavy object had been slammed against her cranium, and she had her throat slit following that kind of bludgeoning with a surgical knife. Arushi's autopsy found no evidence of any sexual assault, and the cuts to both victims' throats, again, highly suspicious because they were done with such accuracy that it initially looked like somebody who had been trained could have been the only people who could have made such fine, slicing. The Delhi police soon became involved, announcing to the public that the murder had been committed by a doctor or a butcher based on these wounds.
A close friend of Arushi's was questioned by the police after it surfaced that she had contacted them no less than 688 times in the month and a half preceding the murder. A new theory quickly arose. Less than a week later, Sharma was removed as a possibility and replaced by none other than Nupur and Rajesh Talwar, the parents, as likely perpetrators. The police were beginning to investigate this under the pretense that Arushi's death had been a dishonored killing. Theories were also swirling in which Hemraj was blackmailing Rajesh over an alleged extramarital affair, as well as Hemraj dying whilst defending Arushi from assault by outsiders, possibly by neighbors or even by their own servants. Which then, of course, led to Arushi's death so that no witnesses were left, or even Arushi being sexually assaulted and killed, and Hemraj being murdered to eliminate witnesses. The honor-killing theory quickly gained traction as the reality of honor killings in India made this an all-too-plausible hypothesis.
Honor and dishonor murders are unfortunate realities for many women in India. Among other countries where religious and cultural values are considered the law of the land, even if they aren't judicially or legally considered as such. Girls and women are held to uncompromising standards, and assumptively bending, let alone deviating from such kind of quiet mandates, guidelines, or regulations can result in getting killed. The honor or stripping of it due to unacceptable behavior or such deviant action done by a girl or a woman not only disrespects the girl or the woman themselves, but their whole family, or at least that's how it's seen in such basically stringent cultures. Honor is one of the most valuable things that any person or family has in India, and disrespecting such honor means that such a killing would be called for. Unfortunately, those who are killed this way, the Indian police often empathize with the murderers rather than the victims. The sexism and misogyny in India is fairly well known, especially as something that causes a lot of issues with criminal cases. There is a history of such killings occurring on our own soil here in the Western Hemisphere, even in our own continent and in our own country. The Uttar Pradesh police, who were handling this investigation, of course, theorized that Arushi and Hemraj had been physically intimate. They were familiar with circumstances like this and their outcome due to the custom and culture, and This circumstance obviously catalyzed far too many traditionalist Indian families to commit such honor killings of their loved ones, specifically their own daughters. If the two had not been physically involved, however, Rajesh could have caught the two in an awkward, if not objectionable, let alone remotely sexual position, and it still could have sent him into a murderous rage. The possibilities seemed endless, and the list of stories grew longer and more rife with implausibility as the public added to the imagination and fueled the plot to it.
The double murder had become an overnight media sensation, and no surprise, this had everything. We have intrigue, we have possible affairs, we have maybe star-crossed lovers. Again, and she was so young, so obviously everything went crazy pretty much immediately. Arushi's 14 years of existence basically were scrutinized with a magnifying glass by almost everyone in the media. Her character, her life choices, her friends, her lifestyle, her personal preferences, all of it was immediately subjected to the intense scrutiny despite her being more or less an average girl. She was a student, not a great one, not a bad one, at a private school, very normal. But of course, because of all of this, despite not having anything unsavory, abnormal, particular, or even a little bit weird, Arushi's prematurely stuffed existence, as well as her family's reputation, were being dragged through the mud in almost every way by the press and the media. The harsh judgments cast by the public worsened an already half-hearted investigation by cops and investigators, already tarnished by the public's opinion, among other issues revealed as we continue on the case. The police had initially called this case cut and dry, easy to close, and so on. I mean, it seemed pretty straightforward. We have 2 dead people. It's easy to assume, hey, this happened, bing, bang, boom, let's go home and have a beer. What happened to complicate these initial assumptions other than just, say, trial by media? Why didn't the Noida police succeed in nailing the murderer or murderers? The Central Bureau of Investigation, which is more or less the Indian FBI, stepped up with a play of power and predetermined sights set on Arushi's parents for both the murder of Himraj and, of course, their own daughter. Uttar Pradesh, which is where the Talwars lived, has a reputation of being one of the most poorly governed states in India. From the very beginning, their investigation was a mess. Local police and federal detectives were described as conducting haphazard, absurd, and defamatory investigation. The quote-unquote administrative dystopia of Uttar Pradesh, as described by a dental patient of Rajesh Talwar, British writer Patrick French, only worsened the conditions and quality of the investigation all the more.
So Dr. Rajesh Talwar, Krishna, whose alias is Kishan, they were arrested by the CBI after he had taken a polygraph test and a narco-analysis test at a forensic science laboratory located in Bangalore, India. Do you want to go over what the narco-analysis is?
Do I ever? If you guys are like me, I'm guessing that you heard narco-analysis and thought, wow, this sounds like a science fiction novel. And you'll be almost right. Narco-analysis is basically where they say, all right, let's get the truth out of you. They strap you down. They give you sodium pentothal?
Yeah, which is not even proven to have any effect really in being a truth serum, which is kind of what it's reputed to be. So
I sort of have the same opinion, and I'm sure that you share it, Cass, that truth serums, quote unquote, I sort of consign them to the lie detector test, where they're not really scientifically proven to do anything except look good in procedural dramas. Right. Whenever somebody needs a dramatic moment and the music starts playing, they go, we have him. Like, it's...
In terms of its plausibility, I would put the whole truth serum thing below polygraph in terms of, like, how much I would put any faith into it. Basically, if any of you have seen Kill Bill, the initial one, yeah, if you've seen the initial one,
I love Kill Bill.
The second one, which is actually the prequel to Kill Bill 2, the first one that was released, whatever. If you've seen it, there's a scene that kind of features truth serum and makes it kind of seem like a more believable facet, if you will. It makes it seem like it's a viable option, and I'm sure when a lot of people saw it, they were like, well, why doesn't the government or law enforcement use it? Well, they shouldn't, because there's really no evidence that it works. So
yeah, there's actually a lot of controversy inside of India because of this. Essentially, they like I said, they have you sit down, they chock you full of drugs, and then they interrogate you. Inside the Indian Constitution, basically, much like in the American Constitution, there's something which basically states you can't self-incriminate. It may not surprise you that being sat down, chock full of drugs, and being interrogated about something you may or may not have done, that can count as self-incrimination. So it operates in this weird legal gray area where legal scholars say this isn't legal, this is unconstitutional, and the police say, well, deal with it, nerds? Maybe not that. They probably say that, but in one of the many dialects and languages of India. I don't speak any of them, so just translate it mentally. So it's not great, in some. Now, Dr. Talwar had taken the test only a day before, and his results had not yet been received by the CBI when they decided just to take him into custody. Krishna, also again known as Kishan, who was a Nepalese pharmaceutical compounder who worked at the clinic run by Dr. Talwar for years, was administered a polygraph test as well. So we're just on a roll here with extremely not great.
Polygraph everyone. Let's just give everyone a polygraph.
Yeah, it's just...
If you look at me, you get a polygraph. If I think that you should, if I think you've met them, you get a polygraph. It's basically where we're at this point, I feel like.
At this point, the feeling that I get is they don't really know what's going on, so they're just like, could it have been you? You? I mean, imagine them pointing at the cat. You?
Yeah.
We're gonna narco-analyze this cat!
Cat doesn't give a shit.
A note, me and cats do not think that a cat has ever been subjected to narco-analysis. Kishan's test results caused the CBI to administer additional lie detector tests, including on one of the Talwar's neighbor servants, Vijay Mandal, as well. The neighbors, Praful and Anita Durrani, were never implicated, nor were they even suggested to be involved. Another servant of a doctor, who the Talwars were also friends with, was arrested by the name of Raj Kumar.
A few days later, the detention of Dr. Rajesh Talwar had actually been extended, and he was forced to take another second polygraph test because the first ones had come back with results being inconclusive, as they do. So when the murder trial finally began, it was even more chaos than the investigation that led up to it. During the trial, Dr. Andrei Simkodsky, a renowned DNA expert, was a witness for the defense, and his opinion was absolutely critical. The police and investigators had clearly botched the entire investigation, was his 100% belief. And I kind of backed this up, to be honest with you. The collection of forensics had been terribly done. All of the evidence had been mishandled. Moreover, the theories that had been strung together by the investigators and by law enforcement and the prosecution, they didn't even make sense or reflect what evidence had been poorly collected in the first place. There's absolutely no physical evidence suggesting there was any sexual activity between Arushi and Hemraj. Dr. Simkodsky was quoted as saying there was none whatsoever, quote unquote. He recalled having to lecture the prosecutor repeatedly to wear gloves and witness key pieces of evidence being touched with bare hands, not on just one occasion, but the same pieces of evidence being repeatedly mishandled by numerous people. The DNA expert was confident that most, if not all, of the evidence that had been collected was contaminated. He also believed that the authorities and investigators had framed the defendant on top of the pathetic investigative work they had tried to pass as legitimate. Basically, they may have been aware that the evidence they collected in the investigation that they had followed through on was really poorly done, but they were too proud to drop their assumptions that the defendants had done it. Worse yet is that they may have been aware that the defendant was innocent, but again, their pride was taking precedent. The doctors and Indian forensics investigators had ignored international standards set and guidelines, from labeling to storage of the evidence, including key evidence that was being presented in court. Quote from the doctor, "A lot of the procedures should have been followed, and in my point of view, they were not diligent. He was also not provided pieces of evidence and information he specifically requested, despite the Indian Supreme Court indicating they had been given to him. The prosecution," the doctor stated, "never provided anything we asked for." Dr. Nupar and Dr. Rajesh Talwar were both found guilty of the murders of Arushi and Hemraj and were sentenced to life in prison.
While, again, sentenced to life in prison, Newport actually captured attention for translating the book Tinka Tinka Dasna from Hindi to English. That book, it's actually a book of sort of life in prison, stories that people who are in prison actually have, stories that people might not necessarily want to hear. For example, the author actually wrote, "Once imprisoned, a person becomes a number, a mere addition to the list of inmates. His dismal life doesn't interest outsiders. All prisoners may not have necessarily committed the alleged crime. This is an attempt to get their voices heard. Dr. Talwar was actually given full credit despite being in prison during the translation. Nupur Talwar is printed on the cover page of the book, and the author, former journalist Vartika Nanda, made sure that her name was credited for translation without any reservation. Both Nupur and Rajesh have also penned original poetry about their murdered daughter, Arushi, which is also going to be included in that book. The remarkable turn of events from the intro, which followed the receipt of Robin's suggestion by literally only a few days, is controversial to say the least. Nearly a decade after the brutal murders of their daughter and their servant, and again after almost 5 years imprisonment since they both received guilty verdicts from a judge in 2013 for the double murder, the life sentences of Nupur and Rajesh Talwar were formally overturned by the highest court in India. That's right. This past October in 2017, the Talwars were acquitted of their previous guilty convictions in the slaying of Arushi and Hemraj. Woo!
Woo!
Dr. Andrei Simikotsky, the DNA expert who admonished the Indian authorities during the trial about their unacceptable processing of evidence, the Allahabad High Court came down on the judge from the Arushi Talwar murder trial, pointing out his ignorance and willful disregard for evidence and circumstance presented during the case. They said he had tried to solve the case using his imagination, devaluing evidence and facts, and convicting Nupur and Rajesh Talwar after presumptuous, erroneous conclusions he derived with methods which should have been left to a math teacher or film director, not a trial court judge. Damn.
Which is an amazing kind of quote, too. Like, they literally compared him to a cinematic, to being a producer, and they completely devalued any kind of faith that they had in him as a court judge, which it obviously makes so much sense with everything that had happened in this case. See, the amount of interference, the lack of proper etiquette, the unacceptable protocol, the disregard for scientific standards from the justice system officials, law enforcement, the prosecution, that was reported by the defensive team, individuals from the defensive side, as well as independent, objective sources. They emphasize a clear and just a devastating conclusion about the entire investigation about the double murder is that it was so botched that no matter who was involved, what was tested or used, there's nothing viable left to locate, let alone prosecute a suspect without any of the evidence being completely impeachable by a defensive counsel.
Even if there was evidence, at this point, none of it's usable because it's just been boofed so hard.
Period. It's the case has basically been completely and utterly corrupted by pride and by just lack of professional standards. The only possibility left to string a case together against a culprit would be found in circumstantial or other non-physical evidence. If there's been evidence that hasn't been discovered, or testimony or confession directly from a perpetrator or perpetrators. And even then, everything substantial that could physically tie or reinforce charges is, like I said, it's impeachable. It's completely something that could be questioned because of how it was handled. Dr. Casey Snood, who represents the Association of Medical Clinics of Noida, was thankful that the Talwars were actually given this benefit of the doubt at long last when they really should have gotten it from the beginning. He was happy that they at least got it at the end. He said that in response to the overturned convictions, and I quote, "Unless there's conclusive evidence, one should not be punished. However, now it will remain a mystery. It has cast aspersions on CBI investigations."
While the Talwars' freedom may help correct the injustices brought upon them, they still have yet to receive closure or justice themselves. 9 years have passed since Arushi and Hemraj were murdered, and who did it is still a mystery. The overturned convictions of the dentist couple reignite the questions of who would or could have done this terrible thing. The CBI contended, still, I would say it's a pretty ballsy move, say that it had to be an inside job. However, if Nupur and Rajesh are innocent, then an outsider had to have committed the homicides, unless they were going to try and pin it on the servants, which were, again, never fully considered. There are many who are disappointed, which makes sense. The majority of those who feel let down by the system consist of those who find themselves in the lower caste of Indian society, many of whom work as domestic help, much like Hemraj, who were immediately sort of treated with suspicion and a lack of dignity. To them, it's proof that the caste system is still in place, even in a non-legal sense, just in a societal way, and that money is always going to matter more than their safety or lives, and that the judicial system in India is one where convictions can ultimately be bought and sold. This system of human value is obvious even when just researching this case. Hemraj's last name is missing from 9 out of the 10, if not more, articles or stories written. His identity, character, history, personality, all of those traits which actually make Hemraj a real person and not just a nameless quote-unquote domestic servant in this, it's gone. And, I mean, finding his last name, even his age, was hard enough. Currently, no new suspects or leads have come to light, and honestly, Cass, I don't think they ever will.
No, and like I said, even if they did, they're not going to be able to follow up or have any solid evidence to prosecute them. As mentioned, it was really a bummer for me because when I was doing research for it too, I was going through and I was like, okay, well, what was the domestic servant's name? And I had to go, I think it was like maybe page 2 or 3 of Google of me just searching for domestic servant Noida double murder name before I found it. And even then it was, everything said, oh, he was from Nepal before it even gave anything about his name. It was almost like they took away his identity completely and just let him fall into the nebulousness of the case. It's really kind of I think it overarches the fact that he was a victim and they just kind of removed him from having any attention. I mean, it's very sad that it's very sad that Arushi was killed too, but there were 2 victims in the case, not just one.
That said, I did want to stress that while honor killings are a huge issue, not just in India, but worldwide, I certainly don't want to give the impression that I think that's never happened, say, in the US. While honor killings of the more quote-unquote traditional nature do occur in the US, there's also I might say, a uniquely American brand, which of course you may be more familiar with at least I'm actually from the South, so there's the whole trope about whenever the girlfriend brings her boyfriend over for the first time, dad's gonna be meeting him while cleaning a shotgun. Again, I just want to say that I certainly don't think that anyone in the quote-unquote Western world can throw stones.
Fairly often in honor killings in India, the Middle East, and in similar places, whether Rushi's homicide was one or not. Now, like I said, the murderers are never captured. They are basically free and never caught, whether due to neglect or by law enforcement or because the victim is simply never reported missing or dead.
Here's a question for you, Cass. What do you think happened?
It's weird because
Hard question, I know,
I'm
right?
just like most true crime fans, where I will concoct an idea and a theory on things. This is a really hard one because they're really, even if you do suspect the parents in some way, there's nothing. But with this one, there just isn't anything because everything is just, every piece of evidence, every theory that you can put together in this, it basically just got, to put it lightly, fucked up. At least, with those cases previously that we've discussed, we've been able to kind of secure some sort of idea. We could, have a presumption. With this one, I don't really feel confident in any theories that I could come up with. It's ridiculous. I mean, I think maybe a neighbor had something to do with it or they know something about it. But I feel bad. I mean, that the parents were blamed at the same time with honor killings being a known issue. I can see why they were kind of pointed at the same time.
We could say that, Doctor Who brought the TARDIS in and, decided to have, I guess, his villainous turn and just go full on. I'm not saying that Doctor Who killed this teenage girl and the domestic servant, but you could say that happened, and you couldn't disprove it with the evidence because the evidence has been completely boned all up and down. I will be frank, her parents' case seemed kind of sketchy. They repainted the patio after a couple months after the fact, which, of course, one could blame them for that, but on the other hand, where were the police here actually getting evidence? They were too busy being yes, this fits our plan. It's like they were thinking of a soap opera instead of looking at the evidence. They tried to make the evidence fit a story rather than make the story fit the evidence. And I think that's pretty common. for just law enforcement in general, and not just India, but in the US as well.
A public opinion is going to affect it. Public opinion is going to obscure it. And with this case, especially on top of the fact that law enforcement and the forensics had been handled so poorly, it just completely skewed it. And it's so hard to even get a grip on where and what could have happened. I mean, maybe the parents do know more than they want to say.
The only firm thing that not even believe, the only thing that I hope is that I really, really hope that her parents weren't involved, because if so, they're free, and we're never gonna know for sure.
Thank you for listening. Of Myth and Mercy is available on Stitcher, Google Play, and iTunes. Check us out on ofmythandmercy.com, Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, and Patreon. Post-production wizardry and music composition by the maniacal genius Aaron Henry.